Alright folks, welcome to the Besides the Norm podcast. My name is Stephen, we've got Craig here. Craig's going to be, as again, taking the lead. This is a debate this time. Craig is going to kind of introduce what's going to be happening, so on you go, my man.
So today we've got another political podcast, which is always fun. It's another EU debate actually, but instead of last time where it was a debate in the sense that we were talking whether we wanted to stay in the EU or leave the EU. Mm-hmm. These are two guys who want to leave the EU, but sort of from a different perspective.
There's a few different opinions. I think we've discussed this just beforehand as well, so yeah, it's going to be pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm quite looking forward
to
it.
I'm talking like they're not here for some reason. Right, they're right next to us, so you want to introduce them?
So we've got Bill Mair again. He's always here.
Hi guys.
Essentially a co-host at this point.
That's right.
And we've got Peter Adams. So Bill Mair from Solidarity, Peter Adams from UKIP.
Good day.
And we'll start off. Why did you join UKIP?
I joined UKIP because they were the only party who wanted to get out of the EU. I first came across the EU and its nonsense regulations back in the early 90s when I was stationed out in Germany. I was the regimental health and safety officer, and there was a whole load of health and safety regulations coming in at that time. And as part of my work, I had to deal with the local trade unions from the German locals that were working within the camp. And we had this particular trade union official who insisted that we must comply with all these new regulations coming in. So, being British, we bent over backwards to do that. But as I travelled around Germany and Holland and Belgium, I was thinking, hang on a minute, these people aren't complying with all these rules and regulations, which was first made me sort of query the whole concept. Anyway, a bit later, in about 2004, when they brought in the regulations on the food supplements and the traditional medicines, I thought, no, this isn't right. And that's when I started to look a bit more about getting out of the EU. And there's a guy called Philip Day who runs a company called Credence Publications, and he does talks around the UK on health matters most of the time. And in fact, he's up here in Glasgow and Edinburgh in April, beginning of May. And the way he normally structures his things, he talks about the health issues, and being a publisher, he's obviously promoting the books that he's doing. And this one particular time, he was talking about a thing called 10 Minutes to Midnight, about why we shouldn't be in the EU. And that made me look a hell of a lot further, and that's when I was looking around and found UKIP, and they were the only party who were advocating that we should be getting out of the EU and taking control of Britain again, and that's why I joined them.
Great. And Bill, why did you join Solidarity?
Well, I joined Solidarity a couple of years ago. Nothing to do with Europe, although we've always had Europe on the back burner in Solidarity. But our main focus in Solidarity as a socialist party is we're the party for the working class, and we're the party for people who are disadvantaged. And that includes people who have come to Britain, migrants, refugees, the working class, poor and disabled. I campaigned for years and years for the rights and the lives of the people of Palestine against the murderous attacks and the brutality of the pariah state of Israel. And so it was a natural home for me after years of campaigning for Palestine, when I was looking for a political party to join, and then later a political party to stand as a candidate for. Solidarity would be the natural choice for me.
Right. So, that's fantastic. So, EU, you both want to leave.
Yep, that's right.
Both got different reasons, I'm assuming.
Do
you already know the different reasons, or is it a guess?
Well, I suppose there are some things that we agree on and other things we disagree on. That's the whole nature, because we're both coming at it from different angles.
And I can list 5 basic reasons why why I want to leave Europe, my party wants to leave Europe. And basically, what the first reason for me is Fortress Europe. I was out in Kos last year, just at the time when the Greeks were having the referendum, whether or not to accept the punishing terms of the Troika in order for them to be bailed out. Out there working with refugees, and got a real flavour of the desperation of people who want to come to Europe. And by the way, we always think of refugees as being from Syria, And most of them are, that's true. But the guys I were working with were also coming from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Afghanistan. Some Palestinians as well who had been displaced into Syria and then displaced again here. So Fortress Europe is this idea that Europe talks about pushing migrants back into the sea. And I spoke to people from Kos. I was really, really impressed when I was speaking to people from Kos, an island that depends on tourism and nothing else. That's the only way they can make their money. And they would say to me, it's ordinary locals, they would say, people criticise us. They say that we should not accept so many refugees coming from Syria. What are we supposed to do? Push them back into the sea? And I thought, that's fantastic. But guess what? That's exactly what Europe wants us to do.
Just the point, Bill.
Yeah.
We're talking about the EU. Europe is a continent. Half of the continent of Europe does not belong to the EU. So let's concentrate on the EU.
I'm talking about the EU, Peter. I'm talking about Fortress Europe. I'm talking about the Fortress Europe and the policies of the European Union, which is to close its borders and limit the amount of people who are allowed to come in from outside.
Yes, but that's not the continent of Europe.
I failed to see a distinction.
No,
that's number one.
That's why the media. That's why the whole BBC and the rest of the media try to blur the distinction between the EU and Europe. You don't want to leave Europe. We can't leave Europe. It's a continent that we are part of.
So
the EU is a political structure.
You're talking about semantics.
No, it's not a semantic.
All right, so I'm clarifying what your objection is, Peter. So I know what it is you're saying. I'm rephrasing back to you to make sure I've got it right. You're correcting me because I said Europe instead of the EU. Is that what you mean? I should be saying the EU instead of Europe, yeah?
They're two different
things. Fair
Europe
enough.
And the EU
Peter,
are two different
I'm going to
things.
warn you, I may make that mistake again, but I'm going to try.
It's not unusual because the media do that and most people believe it.
You should probably, in fact, you know what? How about we just make an understanding here? When I say Europe, I mean the EU, and if I mean continental Europe, I'll clarify that. I understand the semantic distinction, Peter, but I'm not going to make promises I can't keep. I might make that mistake again. That's my first one, Fortress Europe. My second objection to the EU is the anti-nationalisation policy that the EU has. Now, back in 2006, Tommy Sheridan, our co-convener when he was an MSP, he moved the bill to renationalise the railways in Scotland. Because, of course, we used to have all these utilities were nationalised back in the day. And it was discovered after a wee while when this bill ground its way through the Scottish Parliament.
You can't do it.
You can't do it because
Controlled
Europe forbids
by the EU.
That's right.
Transport's controlled by the EU.
The third point here relates to my first point because I just scribbled these down in a hurry, and it's the crushing of Greece. Greece legitimately elected a socialist government with Tsipras and Varoufakis as its finance minister, and they were punished by Greece by the EU for doing this. Now that's anti-democratic. They were crushed and they were humiliated, and Greece was forced to submit even worse terms than they agreed to after the referendum. That's undemocratic, and I do not want to be part of an institution that treats its member countries like that. The fourth issue is TTIP and CETA, and I suspect that Peter and I are going to agree on this, the Transatlantic Trade International Partnership and the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. These are agreements that the EU has with America and Canada, and effectively these agreements give corporations power over European governments. So an American corporation could sue an EU government. That speaks for itself. It's the essence of undemocracy. And finally, we in the EU give favoured trading status to the State of Israel. And Israel is in breach of almost literally countless breaches of UN resolutions, of the Geneva Convention, of human rights legislation. Israel is a rogue pariah state. Hamza Youssef, Alex Salmond have both stood up in the past. I'm not an SNP person, but they come to mind. And they both said, we should not sell arms to Israel and we shouldn't have normal diplomatic relations with Israel, let alone give them favoured trading status. So there's my 5 reasons for wanting to leave the EU.
Well, definitely on the Greek side, that was always going to happen, because when they set up the Eurozone, it was designed based on a German model. Now, the German model was always to keep the inflation low, always below 2%. That was the whole concept of it. And you had Germany, you had France, and you had Holland, and you had the northern European countries tended to work that way. But you will notice that Italy and Greece and the southern ones tended to be a bit more flexible. You used to get a bit more inflation, then realign their currency and whatever. But when they all became squeezed into this one eurozone, that was a recipe for disaster. That was the start of Greece's downfall. It didn't just affect Greece, it also affects Italy. And not only was the Italian government, the Greece government sort of pushed out, but the Italian government, you look at there, they had an EU figurehead sort of put in there to be their leader. And again, so, whoops, sorry microphone, but this whole concept of bundling everybody together by the restrictions of the Eurozone was a recipe for disaster, and this is what happened in Greece is just one part of that disaster.
It's interesting there, Peter, because actually this isn't a scientific survey, but I was talking to a lot of people on that, and of course when I was there, and I was trying to persuade them to vote no to the terms of the Troika. Ochi in Greece, Ochi was the cry. One of the things that the Greek people were most worried about, your ordinary man and Greek woman on the street, was being kicked out of the euro, having the euro, which is, you just spoke about the euro there. And I thought to myself, well, actually, would it not be better for you to be booted out of the euro? I'm not a great economist, but they said we'll have a weak currency. And I would say to them, well, guess what? You're a tourist economy. You rely on people coming into your country. You also export stuff. You export foods, Greek olive oil. It's prized all over the world and so forth. So if you've got a weak currency, that means I can buy more of your stuff with my strong pound, right? So it doesn't sound like a good thing. Weak sounds like a bad thing, just because of that word. But I was saying to them, listen, don't worry about it. It was the weirdest thing. It was kind of almost like the mirror image of a few years ago we had in Britain, this debate about whether Britain would join the euro. And a lot of people were saying, we can't lose a British pound, Queen and country, this sort of thing. People got very patriotic about it. And I wasn't sure there was an awful lot of logic to the argument that people wanted to hold on to the pound. And there probably is an economic argument, but the argument but the argument people were using was, we can never let go of our British pound, that's Queen and country, sovereignty, history and so forth. I was hearing the mirror image exact opposite from the Greeks. They seemed to think that the drachma was a thing of shame if they went back to having a drachma, and they should be part of the euro as a kind of a strong, respected world currency, completely regardless of the black and white facts of the advantages of having a weak currency if you're in the position that Greece was in. But I have to say, that's about the limit of my economic knowledge. This was just my theory.
Well, in that case, Bill, can I recommend that you have a read of this book? How much does the European Union cost Britain?
All right.
It's written by a guy called Tim Congdon, who used to be one of the Bank of England's, advisors, governors. He's been out of that for a while. But when you look at how much we're spending, not only is it the £55 million a day as part of the membership, but there is the other knock-on effect of how the different rules and regulations affect us. I'll give you a little example. When we joined the European Union, we cut off a lot of our trading ties with our ex-Commonwealth partners. One of them was New Zealand. New Zealand had a really hard time when we abandoned them. If you look now, New Zealand butter is coming in here and it's sitting in the supermarkets at round about the same or slightly less than what you're getting from the European ones. Now that's got to pay extra taxes to get over the barrier to actually get into the European Union, right? Now, if we were outside the European Union, that's just one example of how you can get New Zealand butter coming in. It's not paying the extra taxes to get into the EU, so therefore it's going to be even cheaper. There's a lot of the regulations going on for farms and other places like that. They all have extra costs involved, and by getting out we can cut the price of food to us. The whole fishing industry, that was one of the first things that Ted Heath gave away. There was no negotiating about what we're going to get for it. He just basically gave it away to the European Union. And you can see the decimation that's happened to our Scottish fishing industry. Yeah. They are now controlled because the scientists are sitting across there saying, oh, you've got not enough cod, so you'll have to cut down on the cod. Oh, hang on a minute. But there's fishermen out there and they're going to their various fishing areas and they're going, hang on a minute, but we've got loads of cod here. And then they're picking up, and there's a whole thing with the byproduct of pulling in extra fish apart from the cod, because when you throw the net in, you pull stuff in, you're going to get different varieties of fish, and then it's how you account for them. And so there's a whole nausea of that. And because this is a European asset, that means that the Spanish can come all the way from down in Spain all the way up to the North Sea to fish there, and then take that stuff back away from us. And again with the French. So why? Just by getting out there, we can regain our own territorial waters as far as fishing is concerned, and make it a lot more productive, A, for our fishermen, and B, less expensive for us. So that's helping the poor people that you're concerned about on the cost of their food bill.
I just want to point out here, Peter, just on a wee side note, just right at the very beginning there, you said to me, I haven't come any notes, I've come completely unarmed. I know you've got a stack of books there, you've got anyway, sorry, that was just a wee sidetrack there, Peter. Anyway, I want to come back on this idea of what the cost of the EU. Mm-hmm. The cost of the EU, to me, is not actually one of my driving concerns. Reason being that as a socialist, and as a candidate for a socialist party, I believe very strongly in the dictum that we should give each according to his ability, to each according to his need, or to his or her, you would say, updating that from when Karl Marx said it in the 19th century. So if we're a strong economy, and we're supposed to be the 5th strongest economy in the world, I hear, and we're in the EU, then we should have an obligation to support those countries which have a lower economy and have less money. However, a lot of what you said after that, I could agree with you. Talk about having equality of trade barriers. You spoke about New Zealand butter. Although that particular example, when I'm out shopping, if I'm buying wine, I never buy wine from Chile or from Australia or from New Zealand, simply because I think it's absurd from an ecological point of view, an environmental point of view, to ship wine or butter, for New Zealand butter, to ship these foods halfway around the world. And in the case of New Zealand, it literally is coming halfway around. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. When you look at, we're surrounded by cows in this country. You can't drive more than 5 miles. Cows are all over the place. We've got cows running around all over the place. So we're shipping butter from New Zealand. But that's to do with ecology and the environment. I completely agree that we should be treating other countries equally. But I don't agree that we should be importing from the other side of the world. I think that's all really I've got to say on that.
Okay. Just let me go back to the economic side.
Yep.
We've got £55 million a day. Now let's give you an example. I come up and say to you, okay, like we've got this deal. You give me £55 a day, right? Mm-hmm. Now, out of that £55, you can have £30 back to do with. You can do with it what I agree with.
Okay.
So if you wanted to make an adjustment on your house here, right, so what we will do is we will pay you back that 30 quid or the proportion of it. So, but first of all, A, you've got to agree to do it the way I want you to do it. You've also got to pay it all up front, and you've also got to pay an equal proportion. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then, once you've done that and I'm happy with your work, I'll give you your 30 quid. But there's still 25 quid out there got lost somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, is that a way to run a household? Is that a way to run a business? That's the way that the EU economy basically works as far as we're concerned. So we'll put this £55 million a day in. We get about 30 million back. You'll see these signs out of there. This was partially funded by this European bit or that European bit. Europe hasn't got any money. That's our money. So when the council and the local Scottish government and the Solidarity Party and others are talking about austerity, if we weren't paying that money through and filtering it and laundering it through Brussels, it could stay here within the UK. And therefore there wouldn't be all these concerns about having to put the council tax up, about the fact that you couldn't pay for a whole variety of schools and medicines and things like that. That's money that we could use here to the benefit of our people. And that would help people who are at the bottom end of the ladder, people who Bill are concerned about.
I think I'm going to say here, I guess I'd reiterate that I'm not too anxious about Britain as a rich country putting more into a club of countries to benefit poorer countries. That doesn't worry me. Austerity does worry me. It worries me a lot, and it's a big concern of our party. What we tend to look at, what we do look at, and the policies that we have to deal with austerity, focus on making sure that the rich and the billionaires pay their way. Now, recently we had George Osborne, who went in and confronted Google Europe, the chief executive of Google Europe, and demanded that Google Europe pay their taxes in this country, because they've been trading here for years. And he came out triumphant, and he said, look at me, I've done very well, I've gone in there and I've taken no nonsense from this man, I've got £130 million of tax from Google. Now, Google owe about £1 billion in tax for each year that they've been trading here. Never mind 130 million. 130 million is a tax for 1 month. So, you look at the example of Amazon along the road there. We paid 1.8 million to build that. We paid in Scottish Government money, and I've got a freedom of information request back in the flat that I could show you. 1.8 million we paid to build that factory to lure Amazon to come to Fife to build the distribution centre here. And we thought they would get the money back from them in corporation tax once they got the ball rolling, because they're a big corporation. As we all know, they don't pay a penny in tax. And the irony, of course, within the EU, the irony is that they route their money through Luxembourg, another EU country. So Google don't pay any tax, so we're never going to get that £1.8 million back. And if we think, well, never mind, we'll get back through PAYE from the people that work there. No, we won't, because most of them are on minimum wage. And not only that, we're not getting any tax from these people because they make so little. But actually, you and I, Peter, and these guys here, Stephen and Craig, we're subsidising them because we have to subsidise Amazon by giving these guys working tax credits because they're paid so little. Now, if we address that problem, and the reason that that problem exists, by the way, is because the reason why George Osborne was so ineffective is not because George Osborne is an idiot. He may be an idiot. It's not because George Osborne doesn't have a backbone. He may not have a backbone. I don't know. But that's not the reason. He was doomed to failure from the very start. Because the big parties, and I have to say also UKIP included, are funded by major donors, by rich people, by billionaires, millionaires, and, crucially, corporations. So the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the SNP, to a lesser degree, but still including UKIP, all these parties take money from the big, from billionaires, which makes it very difficult then for George Osborne to go in and say to Eric Schmidt, whoever it is that he was speaking to in Google, I demand you pay your taxes. And Eric Schmidt turns around to him and says, George, may I remind you that we give £500,000 to your party, your political party last year. Going on to the element there of, so that's how we would get much more money into the economy to help people to make the rich poorer and the poor richer. The point that you mentioned there about the councils and them having to impose austerity, and of course we've had that very recently with Fife Council. We've had a concrete proposal on the table, fully costed, fully worked out, not a back of a fag packet thing, a private member's bill from Tommy Sheridan dating from 2006, and it's called the Abolition of Council Tax Bill. It proposes a Scottish service tax. This was Tommy Sheridan's Scottish service tax. What the Scottish service tax does is abolishes council tax. At the moment, you've got Anne Gloag up there in Perthshire in Kinfauns Castle. It's worth £2.5 million, I think it's worth. And I'm in my wee two-bedroom flat in Dysett and a Band A flat. Her income is thousands times what my income is.
So
and the
tax level.
The differential between what she pays in council tax and what I pay in council tax is 3, because she's band H and I'm band A. So I pay £772 and she pays whatever 3 times that is, 2,600 and something.
Pays a lot more than that in other taxes.
Stagecoach pay very little corporation tax. Again, they've got very similar mechanisms to Google, Amazon, Starbucks, Boots, all these people. What the Scottish service tax does is it comes in and it says, right, we're going to tax your income. So instead of you paying 3 times what Bill Mair pays in his little Band A flat in Dysett, you're going to pay hundreds of times more. The Scottish service tax makes the poor richer, the rich poorer. The poor would be exempt to pay nothing up to £14,000. You don't pay a single penny. I won't go into all the details because you need to see these numbers written down. The rich would pay a lot more, And according to the Scottish Parliament Information Centre's own figures from 2006, on this white paper, this new tax was projected to generate £505 million more for councils across Scotland. Run that through an inflation calculator from 2006 to the present day, £735 million more for councils, just for councils. Now, the current shortfall for councils across the whole of Scotland, £350 million. And by the way, Nicola Sturgeon's grand new plan that she's got to fiddle with council tax and fiddle with income tax is going to raise a grand total of £170 million. That's half the shortfall. That's half the shortfall. Our proposal would wipe out the shortfall twice over. We wouldn't be cutting services to the elderly. We wouldn't be closing libraries. We'd be building libraries. We wouldn't be paying staff off. We'd be recruiting staff. And we'd be building proper, real council houses across the land at a rate of knots with the money just under the Scottish Service Tax proposal. So what it does is it looks at the same problem that you're looking at, the same problem you look at, the lack of resources, but instead of us focusing on poorer countries in Europe to try to take money from them, we look at the rich and the billionaires and think, they're our target. That's where we'll get the money.
Yes, I like it, Bill. That's
Go on,
very
Peter,
good.
on yourself.
And you don't think that when you put these exorbitant taxes up, that Anne Gloag and people like her will just up sticks and move somewhere else where they don't have to pay tax, just like Sean Connery, her big SNP supporter? Just to go back to what you were mentioning there about council tax, one of the things that UKIP have had since before Tommy Sheridan came up with that is that you'll be aware that VAT is an EU tax. Coming out of the EU, that tax, that proportion of it, doesn't need to go across to Europe anymore. That tax can then become a local tax to be fed back to your local councils. So therefore, by feeding that back into the local councils, you wouldn't have this issue with council tax. So although Tommy was in there in 2006, we were in there before him with what we think is a better alternative.
I've heard the argument before about rich people leaving Scotland if we impose a much fairer tax regime. But the thing to remember is, unlike you and me, Peter, I know a bit about you, and I don't think you're a millionaire, but you may be one of these secret millionaires, but I don't think you are. And I don't think Stephen and Craig are millionaires, although, you can never judge by external appearances. But the difference between us and the super rich is the super rich don't contribute anything anyway. So if they leave, it doesn't matter. We tend to think, it's a logical thing to think, it's a logical knee-jerk reaction. You think, well, if rich people leave, then the country will somehow be at some kind of disadvantage. No, we won't. We have to remind ourselves on a daily basis, unlike you and unlike me, these people don't pay tax. They don't pay anything. The only tax these people pay is on purchase tax, things like VAT, which is a regressive tax. I completely agree with you. Any tax that says that I've got to pay the same rate of taxation when I buy an item as Anne Gloag pays when she buys an item is regressive and unfair. But that's the only way you're going to get any money out of these people, and it's pennies. So if they want to leave, well, good riddance. We would quite happily tax their empty properties when they're out of the country, or seize their empty properties when they're out of the country. What we would not have is exiled billionaires making money in Scotland and paying tax in a second or third country. If you make money in this country, you pay tax in this country. If you don't want to do business in this country and you want to up sticks and leave, Anne Gloag and Brian Sooty, your brother, off you go. Because we'll be renationalising the public transport anyway. We won't need your buses. So you can go. We'll take them, use them for the state. All of these empty threats that you hear, these bully boy threats, the HSBC, they said that if Scotland has independence, then we're going to move our headquarters to Hong Kong. Well, move your headquarters to Hong Kong. Off you go. We'll have an indigenous banking industry. Peter, you and I are both old enough to remember when we were growing up in this country. We had the TSB. That was a nationalised bank that belonged to the government. When we talk about nationalising things, we use the wrong terminology in the same way that you corrected me about Europe in the EU. We should be saying renationalise. All this stuff was nationalised before. We're not proposing anything mad or ridiculous. This is all stuff that's been done before and been proven to work very well before. So if the rich want to leave, good riddance. We'll have your property, and on you go.
What are you going to do with an empty property? And the fact that the people who actually were working there are now unemployed and out of a job and back on you know.
Well, no, because if you take an industry and you move it from the private sector to the public sector...
No, we're not talking about industries as such. You were just talking there about individuals, for
Yeah,
example.
individuals, yeah,
Globe.
sure.
Now, as far as she's concerned, if she, for example, was to say, right, okay, I've had enough of that, I'm up in sticks, whether
Yep.
she's moving down to England or whether she's moving across to somewhere else.
Okay.
Now, she's a big charity donor to quite a lot of the I think it's the one with the eyes. You know, she actually funds a ship to go around to various places and do the operations on there like that. So she can up sticks and move to Africa, and she's still getting monies coming in from various parts of the world. So we're just cutting off our nose to spite our face. And when she does move, the people who are working in her estate, they're no longer employed. So, you know, they're out looking for more work. So in some cases, you are actually cutting off your nose to spite your face. There's this thing, there's this whole thing about, them big, nasty, rich people up there. Well, some of them big, nasty, rich people up there started off like you and me and have actually worked their way up there to do that. Now, Bill will come back and tell me, yes, they've done it on the back of the workers and how they've not been paying them properly. But just to go back to Anne Gloag and her brother,
I like you do my side of the dialogue as well, Peter.
They started off by buying a couple of buses, and they've grown that business. And as part of that growth, although Bill will say they're not paying their taxes, they might not be paying the correct wages and other things like that, they're still employing a heck of a lot of people, not just here in Scotland, but the rest of Britain and even across in other parts of the world where they have now branched out. That's enterprise. That's people growing and being able to do things. And that's the great freedom about Britain, that people who, like you and me, we can start off and we can build a business. We can grow that. If you leave it in the hands of the state doesn't grow things. It stagnates and it drains it. That's been proven by communist countries all over the world. That's why socialism doesn't work, Bill.
Peter, I'm glad you mentioned state industries all over the world. I think I'm going to talk about Cuba and I'm going to talk about the pharmaceutical industry, but before I do, just very quickly I'll come back and just repeat a point which I said. We're going to repeat it again. If Anne Gloag and Brian Souter up sticks and go and live in Africa or wherever they want to go and live, the buses will still need to be running. Somebody's going to be needing to run those buses, drive those buses, fix those buses, wash those buses. The same number of people, in fact, a greater number of people will be required to be employed in the bus industry, in a nationalised industry, than in a private industry, because a private industry is all about maximising for profit and keeping things lean, which essentially is a euphemism for paying people off and putting them on the dole. A nationalised industry is about the greater good. It's about not only the individual employees, it's about the state.
We pretend to employ you and you pretend to work.
So your employee problem, that's sorted. Now, you spoke about state industry stagnating, and you seem to imply they're a bit rubbish. Now, Cuba is a fantastic example of a fully functioning communist state. Now, I've got the advantage on Cuba because I've visited several times and I have a degree in Spanish, I speak Spanish, and I have a strong interest in socialism. So I've been there and I'm able to speak to ordinary Cubans in their own language and find out, over and above what we can learn in the media, both the Cuban media and our own media. So I think I've got a wee bit of an insight. I'm not an expert, but I've got a bit of an insight. But the one thing I can talk about that I don't need to pretend to have special knowledge, we can go away and we can check it for ourselves. It's in the mainstream media. Last year, Cuba, because it has this embargo around it, it's being essentially punished by the United States because it's a communist country and it offends the United States. There's an embargo on Cuba, and American companies are prohibited from trading with it. Not only that, but any ship that docks in a Cuban port from any country in the world is then prohibited from docking in an American port for 6 months after that. So America not only bullies Cuba, it bullies all the countries in the world into, I don't like Cuba, he's not my pal, so you're not allowed to be pals with it.
Oh, so that's why you want to do the same thing with Israel?
As a result of that, Cuba has been forced to be very self-reliant. And you've probably seen, you've seen programmes about how they could be very inventive, and at one point they were inventing this new brake fluid using shampoo and motor oil or something, I think it was, because they just can't import hardly anything. The Cuban pharmaceutical industry, which is state-owned, obviously, because all the industries in Cuba are state-owned, The Cuban pharmaceutical industry last year has started developing vaccines which cannot be found anywhere else in the world. Vaccines against cancer, which they are now selling or making available to developing countries for pennies, turning the whole paradigm, the whole usual way of operation of the pharmaceutical industry on its head. Because normally what the pharmaceutical industry does is it puts profit before people.
I agree with you there, Bill.
And it will, of course it will endeavour. What it will do is it will seek to find people's illnesses, and then it will seek to make a profit from it. We heard the story of this chap called Martin Shkreli. He was an American bloke last year who bought some palliative drug for people who were suffering from AIDS and cancer. He bought the patent for it, and it used to sell at $13.50 a tablet, and he raised the price because he has a monopoly to $1,000 or something, and I'm not exaggerating, it's at least $1,000 a tablet. Do you know why he did it? A, because he could, and B, because he's incredibly greedy. That's the way the pharmaceutical industry normally works. Cuba has done two fantastic things, or perhaps it's three fantastic things. It's inventing, researching, developing, inventing brand new drugs that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Obviously, it's making them available to its own people for pennies. But additionally, on top of that, it's making the noble gesture, is leading the world and showing us how we should be behaving. It's making those drugs available to developing countries who normally would be exploited by the big drug companies, and saying, there you go, you can have this at cost. If you want to get into Israel as well, I'll get into that, but you maybe want to come back to him about the Cuban drug thing.
Yes, no, I'm quite happy on Cuba, because the thing is, Cuba, as you said, is an island. It's embargoed. It's sitting there on its own in the middle of the sort of the Caribbean Ocean across there, and it's got to work together. They don't have a choice. They can't be, as even within them, that you still get a little bit of that sort of free spirit and entrepreneurial thing. But the thing is, you are an island out there in Cuba. They are embargoed by the rest of the world. So they've got to be enterprising about being able to do that. They're basically, as far as anybody else is concerned, they are almost like an individual family stranded on this island, and nobody else can bring in anything to them. So they've got to be inventive. They've got to do that. And, all credit to them with the fact that coming out about the vaccines. Now, while we're on about vaccines, let me get started on one of my hobby horses, is the fact that these big pharmaceutical companies, they don't want to cure people. There isn't any profit in curing. They want the people to be dependent on their drugs. There are cures going around this world for just about everything that's out there. There are cures for cancer. But you know why they won't get them? Because, they haven't been through the testing process. They don't meet the gold standards. Well, hang on a minute. We ain't going to get anybody to do that, because all the stuff that you've got there are natural products which cannot be patented. If you cannot patent them, you cannot make a profit on them.
But all medications are started off by natural sources.
No.
Yeah, that's where they get the chemicals from.
No.
That's how they start off medications.
A lot of stuff started with natural products, because you used to have the herbalists. You used to have the witches in the village. They knew about the herbs, they knew about the spices, they knew about the other natural products which could help heal things. Now, when today's modern medicine started, what they found was that, well, hang on a minute, because we're getting this stuff here, we cannot patent it, so therefore we can't stop other people copying it. So to be able to bring a patent on it, they had to change things. That's why it then became synthetic. Even things like vitamin C, you've now got a synthetic version instead of a natural version. Most of the stuff is a synthetic version that goes into these drugs. All these different ones have different side effects. That's why when people get older, they have what they call the brown bag effect. You start off with one pill for a specific disease, whether that's your heart or your high blood pressure or something else, and I've got some side effects. Don't worry, we have got some other pills here we can give you to counteract that side effect. So you now got 2 pills instead of 1. I've got some other side effects since I've started taking these other. Don't worry about that, we've got some more. So you finish up with 4 pills, and then 8 pills, and you finish up with a bag of different pills, and that's brilliant for the pharmaceutical companies because they're raking in money. Now, what should be happening, for example, the Scottish government here, They have been paying out to, as far as cancer is concerned, they've been paying out millions of pounds for specialist drugs for specialist cancers. What they actually should be doing is saying, look, there are these cures out there. Let us take them through the process. Let us, as a government, whether that's the Scottish government or whether it's the British government, pay for these to go through the process. Then it will be gold standard, tested, and we can give them to the people and cure them and save all this, instead of this constant drain on our NHS. You look at the billions of pounds that are lost to the NHS to promote the pharmaceutical companies and keep their shareholders.
Now, unfortunately,
unfortunately,
Peter, I'm going to have to agree with you. Solidarity stands for a nationalised pharmaceutical industry. So the only thing that we say nationalise instead of renationalise is a pharmaceutical industry. You look at the NHS and Peter's assertion that the drugs industries are basically exploiting and manipulating sick people, putting profit before people. We agree with, and that's why we think we've got, in Scotland, still we have a fantastic NHS. It's not perfect, but it's the envy of the world. It's the best there is in the world in terms of a state-supplied healthcare. And yet we waste billions. I think the last figure I looked at was £1.4 billion in Scotland spent by the NHS on drugs or medicines or pharmaceuticals, whatever you want to call it. Now, of course, the NHS has no choice in that. They have to use these drugs to cure the ailments. How much better? How much better if the NHS was getting its drugs from a nationalised pharmaceutical industry? That would then address a lot of the points that Peter's made, because now it's no longer the motive here, the goal here is not to maximise profits, to give to shareholders them to run off and put all their money in some tax haven in Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands or Gibraltar or wherever it may be. The goal here, like the NHS, is simply to provide the best possible care at the point of delivery and take profit out of the equation. That's the magic and the beauty of the nationalised industry. Peter, because I've agreed with you, I'm going to have to try a bit harder. And I'm going to try to move the discussion on. You spoke earlier about austerity, and I said, I think if I remember right, I was basically saying, look, we're both looking at the same problem. Like, if you're looking at a top spinning on a glass coffee table, you might look down on it and say it's spinning clockwise. I might be underneath the coffee table looking up through the glass and saying it's spinning anti-clockwise. Mm-hmm. I reckon the problem with austerity is not to do with the amount of money that we're giving to Europe, although I'm for coming out of Europe, so that problem takes care of itself. Neither is it to do with the amount of money that we're giving to people who are unemployed, neither is it to do with the amount of money we're giving to people with disabilities, and neither is it to do with migration or refugees. Now, I know that UKIP has a position on, you pointed out earlier, I think before we started recording, that UKIP's policy on migration is to limit migration. Our policy in solidarity is that we would have open borders. We don't differentiate between people on the colour of their passport, i.e. where they come from, or the colour of their skin. It makes no difference. We're all people. A working class man in Kennoway has just as much in common with a working class man from Syria or Afghanistan, and he has much more in common with a working class man in Afghanistan than he does with Brian Souter, who may or may not have worked his way up from the bottom. It's not how he got there, it's where he is. But here's the thing. Peter, we spoke earlier about how your party is often labelled racist, or your policy in immigration is labelled as racist. That's not my intention today. My intention right now, today, is to say, I think you guys are mistaken. I think you guys are looking at that glass coffee table from the wrong angle. You're looking at that spinning top and you're telling everyone it's spinning clockwise. And I want to say to you, it's spinning anti-clockwise. What I want to say to you is that in Scotland, we have masses of empty space. People come to Scotland from London and the big cities. They cannot believe it, the quality of life we have here. And my quality of life is room to stretch out and room to breathe, okay? We have masses and masses and masses of empty space. We also have a massive shortage of council housing because of Margaret Thatcher and her right to buy. Disastrous policy, because she sold off all the council houses for pennies to council tenants but failed to build any to replace them. As a result, we've got all sorts of people on waiting lists waiting for council houses. Okay? We've got all sorts of shortages, and that's just one example. So I'm looking at these two things, I'm thinking, right, As a result of our intervention in the Middle East, we've destabilised all these countries across the Middle East. We're complicit in that disastrous, murderous mess in Syria. On the macro level, because our government has intervened and meddled and destabilised the country, but even on the micro level, because the bombs that are dropping in Syria, the components of those are made in Glenrothes, and you could drive there from here in 10 minutes. We're actually dropping them from RAF jets. So we're dropping the bombs that are making the people flee in terror to come to our country for safety. So we have all sorts of levels of obligations to these people coming to this country. But more than that, when I spoke about when I was out in Kos and I was working not just with Syrians, Afghanistani people and Pakistani people, Bangladeshi people, people say economic migrant. They're fleeing poverty. The Syrians are fleeing war. These other people are fleeing poverty. But one way or another, when you mentioned earlier on about how New Zealand is disadvantaged because of trade tariffs. And of course, these former Commonwealth countries, they used to be our friends. They used to say to the people from the Commonwealth countries, because we came and colonised your country, you're now technically a British citizen, you can come to our country whenever you want. We said that to the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. We've changed our mind on that.
No, we didn't. The European Union changed their mind. The European Union changed the regulations.
Fair enough, Peter. I'll go with that. Thank you. That's a learning point for me. The point is that these guys are victims of European/British oppression in one form or another. So I say, and I'm party says, open the borders, let them in. But here comes a problem. When I say stuff like that, I will hear voices, perhaps from you, perhaps from other people, saying, but we haven't got enough resources to cater for these people. We don't have enough resources to go around at the moment, so if we let in hundreds of thousands of people, then we're going to have a disaster. Agreed. What we need to do is free up the resources, rather than squabbling over this tiny little cake which we have been given by the ruling classes. And I blame UKIP, and UKIP blames the migrants, and someone else blames the disabled, and someone else blames that person over there with a different colour skin, and at some point someone's going to jump up and gay people are going to get blamed. No. What we do is we unite, and we focus our rage and our indignation on the ruling classes, on the Brian Souters, on the Eric Schmidts, on the billionaires of this world who live here in this country and don't pay their way. The billions and billions, probably trillions of pounds that we could extract. Never mind putting up the top rate of tax. Just enforce the top rate of tax. If you make your money here, you pay your taxes here. Instead of swanning around like a cock of the walk at some business networking meeting boasting about how much money you made last year and how little tax you paid. That should be stigmatised like drink driving. When you and I were boys, we used to get jokes about drink driving. People thought it was funny. Well, that's what we need to do with tax evasion. That's what we need to do. If some rich fat cat stumbles out of his cigar club and falls on the pavement and gets mugged by somebody and has his wallet stolen, he'll be grateful for an ambulance to come and pick him up and take him to a hospital. He'd be grateful for a policeman to step in and stop being robbed. He'd be grateful that there was a street light there in the first place so we didn't trip up in the first place. Well, guess what? Those are paid for by taxes. They're paid for by taxes. You pay your taxes, I pay my taxes, the boys here pay their taxes. It's time for the rich, the billionaires to pay their taxes. And then when they do, I predict that you and your party won't give a rat's backside about immigration. You know what? Because there's plenty enough to go round. And maybe you'll still have your views on Europe, and probably you will, because some of them I even agree with. But it will stop us squabbling amongst ourselves. The working class, and I include you in that, Peter, whether you like it or not. It will stop us squabbling amongst ourselves about who's to blame amongst it. So the white man's not blaming the black man or the refugee. We're all blaming the real culprit, the greedy, the rich, the billionaires. I don't think you're a racist. I think you're very, very mistaken.
Well, I happen to think you're very mistaken. But there again, we're both coming from opposite sides. The fact that you were saying there about, looking at the spinning top. I won't. The whole issue is, as far as race is concerned, we don't have a problem with race. You talk about the immigration side of it. As far as we are concerned, we are happy for anybody from any part of the world to come into the UK, providing that there is a need for them. And that's why we would work on a point system similar to Australia, similar to Canada, where people they come in, they've maybe got they've got a job lined up, or they've got something there, they can come in, And as part of that controlled entry, you can forecast roughly how many people are coming in. So therefore, you can forecast how many houses you need to build. You can forecast how many schools you need for your potential kids that are going to be growing. You can forecast how your hospitals and things for there. But what's happening at the moment is because of EU regulations, we cannot control anybody who's coming in from within the European Union. So they can come in. We have no way of keeping track of the numbers. So just out of, for example, a lot of times when people, when they started a few years back, a lot of people came to the Peterborough area from the new eastern countries. That was swamped. You know, they overtook the schools, the housing and all the rest of it. If you're bringing in a controlled amount, then you can control the housing to make sure that people aren't sleeping on the streets. You can make sure that people, you know, there are jobs for them to come into. The other thing is, as far as the government and their immigration policy is concerned, they say, oh, we're cutting down. Yes, they're cutting down. They cannot touch who's coming in from the EU, so they're putting ever more barriers to people from other parts of the world. One of the things, again, that the EU does, and I've mentioned there about the trade barriers, the best way to help people to get better is to help them grow. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, there's whole countries out there who are wanting to actually trade with other parts of the world. Not only produce food for themselves, but trade with other parts of the world. But because of the EU barrier that I mentioned before, it's harder for them to get into the EU. Yet, the EU is sitting there with food surpluses and are actually subsidising that to sell it off cheaply and undermine markets in Africa. So that's another reason why we need to be out of the EU. As far as we're concerned, you can promote people who are in poor countries by helping them to bring themselves up. Not, as Bill says, by getting rid of these rich people at the top. And because it's, in a lot of cases, it's these rich people at the top who their efforts have actually made money and brought it into the economy. Now, Bill seems to think that having somebody who's an elected bureaucrat will be able to manage the railways, will be able to manage the banks a lot better than free enterprise will. Well, look across at Europe. You've got the bureaucrats sitting across there. They haven't been able to square their books for 20 odd years. 20 odd years, you know. If that was you as a business or as a household, you know, you'd be bankrupt. And this is the model that people are saying we should be as part of this United States of Europe. Definitely we should be out. And as far as people are concerned, people have a natural inclination to try and better themselves. When you take your kids to school, you want your school kids to do better at school than what you did. You want them to attain better at school than what you did. You obviously, when they come out of school or university or whether they've gone to tech college and got a trade and things like that, you want them to do better. That's a natural feeling for your kids. And therefore, as part of their progress, they want to do better. And when they get their kids, they want to do better. So everybody's looking to try and raise their standards. But when you're in somewhere, as has been shown in the old communist bloc countries, where you pretend to work and we'll pretend to pay you, you can keep everything down. You can have everything being run by the government, but you know what? Those people who are sitting as part of the government controllers, they are just like these millionaires and billionaires that Bill is trying to bring down. Because they're sitting there, instead of being honest about it and saying, look, this is my business and I'm building it up and I'm taking the profits, they're sitting there saying, oh, this is a state-owned thing, we're helping the people. You go and have a look at the Kremlin and the people sitting at the top there. Okay, maybe Bill's earlier example about Cuba and Fidel Castro, he was a lot more down to it. But if you look at around these other countries that are supposed to be communist countries, they have still got their elite that have got everything. But they've never paid for it. They've blatantly done it on the backs of the people. Whereas the people who are actually building businesses up, they are quite open about it.
Peter, I agree with you that Russia is a very bad example of socialism or communism. The key here is a phrase that you said halfway through your last answer the. You spoke about how an elected bureaucrat couldn't be trusted to run the railways. I think it was the example you were talking about, or whatever it was.
Most of them aren't elected, Bill.
Well,
they're manoeuvring in there because of their party contacts.
Okay. Well, we believe very, very strongly in solidarity in democracy. We believe very strongly in democracy as the process for government and just the way to go. The problem with countries like China and Russia is, of course, that democracy is lacking. And so if we have an elected bureaucrat, then I'm very happy. An elected bureaucrat would be a politician. It would be something like you when you're seeking to be elected. And me when I'm seeking to be elected, we would then become elected bureaucrats. And if we can't trust our elected bureaucrats, then we haven't got democracy.
But Bill, what I mean by bureaucrats are people like the civil service.
Okay,
Civil servants,
they're unelected.
The unelected bureaucrats, they are the ones who are running Brussels.
Yeah, no, and listen, I'm with you on that.
You know,
I'm with you on that. And TTIP, of course, is currently being negotiated by unelected bureaucrats in the European Commission. Yeah. That's my problem with it, because it's not being elected. It's not being discussed by elected bureaucrats. Now, I'm going to claim another bit of special insight here in response to the German Democratic Republic, the former East Germany. My sister-in-law lives in Bad Blankenburg in Thüringen, which is in what we used to call East Germany, very close to the Czech border. So it's right deep into East Germany.
I know where it is.
And she's, I think I'm going to estimate her age at kind of late 40s, early 50s. The reason that I say her age, I'm sorry if that's being indiscreet, sorry about that, is because she lived through both. She has lived through both systems. She's lived through the communist system, and she's lived, obviously, now in the democratic system, or what we call the democratic system. Now, she's an eyewitness. And she talks about the old days under communism. She has mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand there were shortages, but on the other hand she said there was security. We had security.
Exactly.
Everybody had a job, and everybody had a house. And the thing is, you were stationed in Germany. I don't know how much you travelled through Germany when you were there. I know very little. I've travelled once the length and breadth, and once up and down, and once across, and that's it. From east to west and up north to south. But because she lives deep, it's like Hansel and Gretel country where she lives.
I know where it is. Near the Czech border.
Near the Czech border. It's absolutely beautiful. So we always have this idea of Soviet architecture in East Germany as being concrete slabs, and it looks absolutely forbidding and grey, and everybody's covered in soot, and it's like a monochrome film. Nothing could be further from the truth where she lives. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it hasn't changed any under this new system. So again, we have to attenuate this myth about capitalism is good and communism and socialism is bad. There's a question I always ask people when they tell me socialism would never work. I say socialism would never work. Here's the thing for you. Capitalism doesn't work. Capitalism isn't working. I used to look when I was a boy at documentaries about India, and you'd see people scrabbling in the gutter, like Slumdog Millionaire, human beings being forced to live like animals, desperate poverty. And then you'd see in the background a Rolls Royce or a Bentley car would drive past, and you think, how could you have such inequality? How could you have such disparity in a country? That's disgusting. By the fact that these countries, India, for example, has a nuclear program and a space program, and you still have this poverty. That's criminal. But now I look at Scotland. And I read the stories, and they're true, because I have comrades who work in the food banks and comrades who work supporting people negotiating with the DWP for their unemployment benefits and disability benefits. These stories that you read in the paper about people going to food banks on the way home from work, these stories that you read about people going without food in order to be able to afford the bus fare to go in to do their interview, in order to get the benefits, in order to be able to live and feed their children. Stories of people fainting in unemployment benefit offices now called DWP offices. These are true, Peter. That's this country right now in the 21st century. So I've got to remind myself, wait a minute, Bill, you used to criticise India and say, what a disgusting country, that disparity and that inequality and all that sort of stuff, and as a result of capitalism. And that man driving past in his BMW or his 7 Series or whatever it might be, maybe he scrabbled his way up from the bottom and made his way to the top like the way you claim Brian Souter does. I don't know. Let's just take for the sake of argument. It doesn't matter. The point is that under capitalism, you have obscene, disgusting disparities of wealth and poverty, and real poverty. And we have poverty in this country which would turn your stomach if you had to see it, let alone experience it. That's capitalism for you. So never mind this conditional, this socialism would never work. Capitalism doesn't work. Capitalism isn't working. Capitalism is killing people. And the idea that people would never struggle to better themselves or struggle to produce anything in the state industry, I take you back to Cuba. I take you back to Cuba and say, look, despite all the problems and obstacles that country has to overcome, the sheer inventiveness, the vibrancy, the energy of Cuban industry is amazing. And the pharmaceutical industry is the one I go on about because you can go away and you can check it, you can Google it, you can read about it for yourself. That's not a country that's founded on capitalism. And nobody in Cuba's thinking, if I work hard, I'm going to get a Rolls Royce. If I work hard, I'll get a big...
They don't get Rolls Royces across the country.
Okay.
And if you go back to your communist countries, there's only one brand of car. East Germany, you had the Trabant, you know.
I think there were 2 or 3, but I get your point.
You had a
There was
couple
one
of
began with B, but I've forgotten the name of it.
You had a couple of choices: take it or leave it. That was the style of car. You couldn't even sort of get specific colours. You had to take it or leave it. And as far as East Germany was concerned, what you used to have to do was you had to pay for your car about 5 years before you actually got it. You had to pay for your car, and then the money that you'd supposedly got, that then was supposed to have sort of paid for the bits to put it together. But you finished up with one style of car. At least out here, you know, if you don't like being around in a Rolls Royce, you can drive around in your Skoda or your Ford or whatever it is that you want. You've got choices. And that's part of the beauty of free enterprise, is you've got choices. When you're in a controlled socialist communist state, then you don't have choices, because the people, the bureaucrats sitting at the top, they tell you what you can have, whether you can like it or not. Now, just to go back to when you nationalise everything here in Britain, Bill, or Scotland, whichever way you like to do
Scotland,
it.
Please,
Right,
Scotland.
okay.
We're a pro-independence party, Peter.
Yeah. Oh, of course, I forgot.
We're getting to that as
I
well.
forgot.
We could be here all day.
I forgot that.
And by the way, sorry,
so
carry on.
How are you going to select the people to actually run, for example, the buses and the railways? How are you going to select the people to sort of, do that?
Well, the wonderful thing is, when we look at renationalisation, you've already got, in the example that we had earlier about Brian Suter and Anglo upping sticks and away to live in Africa or somewhere in some mansion elsewhere, it's only 2 people that up sticks and leave. The entire workforce is left behind. All the skills, all the administration,
Them
is still there.
them two are the individuals. There are other rich people around as well.
Okay, off go the rich people. But let's just take one industry, because you said who's going to run the railways, who's going to schedule, right? So I'll talk about the buses, simply because I've started, so I'll finish. but Peter, what I'm saying to you is that the HR, the personnel, the infrastructure, it's already there. So the guy or the woman who works out all the timetabling and liaises with the local council about which buses go where and where does the X7 stop and where does the X50 stop and so forth, these people already exist.
Yeah, but who's going to be at the top managing them?
Who's going to be at the top managing them is with the state industry. It's the same as, for example, your NHS, and you were at one point on the NHS board for 5.
Yeah.
And had to step down because you were standing for election, as I remember.
No, I didn't have to step down. The NHS actually made it a cock up, and I was reinstated by the court because they got it wrong.
Good for you, Peter. Right. Point is, who's going to run it? It's going to be run ultimately by elected politicians. It's going to be run by civil servants who are answerable to elected politicians, the same way that your local council is run, the same way that any government service is run. At some point, there's going to have to be a bloke at the top who is on a salary.
You're Tommy,
and then a bloke at the top who's an employee, and then answerable to the Scottish government. Mm-hmm. And in our future, we talk about the Independent Socialist Republic of Scotland. So he'll be answerable to the Scottish Parliament, or the Parliament of the Independent Scottish Republic. Independent Socialist Scottish Republic, Peter. But listen, this is like, without going too much off piece, this is a bit like when people say, listen, when we were talking about independence, people would say, listen, what are you going to do about banking? What are you going to do about the armed forces? What are you going to do this, that, and the next thing? They'd have 100 questions. What are you going to do about it? And they'd fire them like tear gas cannons at you. And I would say to them, look, we're not the first country in the world to go independent. If we do, if and when. There used to be a country called Czechoslovakia. That's where Thuringen used to abut onto. It doesn't exist anymore because it's the Czech Republic and and Slovakia. When I was a little boy, I lived in Malta. Now, because my dad was in the Navy. In 1964, Malta declared independence from Britain. When I was a little boy living in Malta, we had two parallel currencies, the Maltese pound and the English pound, or the British pound. They were worth exactly the same amount of money, so it was kind of irrelevant. It was like having a Spanish euro or a German euro. But in time, those two currencies diverged, and I had two currencies going along at the same place, in the same way. So all these things have been done before.
Yes.
So to go back to what you were saying, to relate this to what you were saying, and to wrap up, you're saying, who will run this? How will it work? It will run pretty much the same way as it's running now. But remember, Peter, we are talking about re-nationalisation. We're about taking it back to how it was. This is not untested territory.
But the examples that you've just given me, they haven't sort of stayed in the communist socialist system. They have used free enterprise to actually grow their country. You were talking there, about the Czech Republic and things like that. They are actually using free enterprise to grow their system, not the socialist system. They rejected the socialist system because they could see, and they'd been under the cosh of the communist system for so long, that you finish up there and you've got this bureaucracy similar to what you've got. In fact, it's amazing because Khrushchev, a number of years ago, he says, I cannot understand how Western Europe have spent so long trying to destroy the Soviet Union, and they are actually trying to recreate it themselves with the European Union, with a central bureaucracy, this control from Brussels. So from a guy who was there and who had liberated Russia from the yoke of communism and had started to break it up and bring free enterprise in, he's looking at in amazement at the European Union and saying, these people are just trying to recreate what we've just been getting rid of. So that comes back to what me and Bill have both been saying. It's time to get out of the EU. So come the 23rd, please vote out.
Come the 23rd, vote out for good reasons, as I've explained. I'm for Lexit. Lexit is left exit. Peter is for Brexit, a kind of general term for Britain coming out. Obviously, I don't accept all of Peter's arguments. We agree on some points. We knew we agreed on those points when we came in. The points that I wanted to persuade Peter about, sometimes you don't always see the fruit of your labours immediately. Sometimes you have to wait. You plant the seed and you come back and it's grown a little bit, and before you know it's flourishing. So I hope that I planted the seed of socialist wisdom in Peter Adams' mind, and that the next time we see him, he'll...
Did he post...
No, I was just going to say, posting that about there, my sister was a long-term sort of member before they had the split of your socialist party here in Scotland, right? And as I mentioned to you before, I know one of your candidates from up in the Dundee area, Philip Stock, very well.
I've not been able to find him. He's not one of our candidates. He might be one of our... But I've not been able to track him down, Peter.
Well,
he might be from the other lot.
No.
Don't mention him.
But anyway, so, I have had personal experience with Solidarity and socialist parties and individuals who are close to me who feel that way. They've not managed to persuade me. I've not managed to persuade them. Life's like that. Wouldn't it be boring if we were all the same? You'd just be like in a communist country being controlled from the top.
Which is definitely preferable to being in a capitalist country where you're exploited from the top and have everything sucked from you to feed the never-ending greed of the billionaires.
Many of these billionaires put money back through their charitable foundations.
If they just paid their taxes, there would be no need for their charitable donations. This is guilt money, and we don't need it.
It is guilt money, and
that's
why they pay it back in charity.
In the same way that they give a couple of million to a political party, although normally it's less than that, it's £500,000, in order to inoculate themselves against a tax bill of billions. If you're going to say to me, look at Anne Gloag, and I don't know, let's make a guess that she makes £4 million of charitable donations. I can guarantee you that's going to be 100th of what she should be paying, of what she's morally liable for in tax.
If you want to really go to it, let's talk about Bill Gates and the fact that his so-called charitable process, where he's going around inoculating and vaccinating all these countries that are struggling, and all these vaccinations and things is all going back, the costs of that is all going back into different pharmaceutical companies. So sometimes people, when they're doing charitable things, can be beneficial. But other times, like Bill Gates is doing, he is basically trying to suppress, subdue, and to break people.
I know very little about Bill Gates, but I think if you're going to make charitable donations, make charitable donations out of the money you have left over after you pay your tax. And the spirit of the age, as we're seeing across Europe, with Spain, with Greece, with Portugal, each of which has elected to a greater or lesser degree a socialist government. This is a spirit of the age. We speak about communist countries not thriving and communist countries wanting to come into the capitalist system. Yes, it's true that we have spent a lot of time, a lot of money as Western countries propagandizing these countries and selling them the great American dream. Under capitalism, as Peter's described, the streets are paved with gold and everyone can be a millionaire, but they can't. The point is that the rich need to be poorer, the poor need to be richer. We need greater equality, and with that greater equality, with that social justice, we can wipe out the social problems that we've got in this country, and we can also wipe out the petty arguments, the squabbling over resources. The whole remit, the whole gambit, the whole aim of the ruling classes is to get me squabbling with Peter and Stephen and Craig and the Syrian refugee and goodness knows who else. We're squabbling with each other. We take our eye off the ball and we take our eye off the real culprit, which is the ruling classes, the billionaires and the politicians who belong to political parties which are in the pockets of the billionaires. So vote out, but before you vote out on June the 23rd, do remember to vote for Solidarity on May the 5th, which is even more important, for an independent socialist republic.
But the great thing about it is you can help people by pulling everybody up to a higher level instead of pulling people down to a lower level.
Socialism is pulling people up to a higher level at the expense of the super rich. But listen, do you know what? If we took £100 million off, you mentioned Bill Gates. I can't remember what his net worth is. It's staggering. If you took £100 million off Bill Gates, if you took a few £1 million off Ann Suter or Brian Glogue, I got the names mixed up there. If you take a few £1 million off a billionaire, he wouldn't notice it. You're only denting his or her pride because it's an infinitesimal small amount of what they actually have. Nevertheless, this is what they're due to pay morally in taxes, and it was sought out our system. What happens? It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. You spoke about Brian Suter being self-made. It's always puzzled me. Rich people get rich, and you think, at what point will they arrive at the conclusion, I have more than enough money. I have more than everything that I want. Never mind what I need. I have more than everything that I want. How many Ferraris can a man or a woman have? At what point are they going to say to themselves, you know what? I'm done here. This is great. Maybe I should start paying my taxes. But they don't, because it's like a drug. It's like a pharmaceutical. You become dependent upon it. And they become dependent on amassing more and more and more and more and more wealth. No. And the richer they become, the less that they contribute to society. It's a sickness. It's an illness. This whole idea of bettering yourself is a euphemism for exploiting the lower classes in society. It's just a euphemism for that. Yes, we want to better everybody and bring up the bar. Of course we do. But we're quite open about the fact that we will do this at the expense of the super rich.
Many people who are super rich do get to the stage that you spoke about. And the fact that they're saying, hang on a minute, I've made enough money, I've got more than enough to keep me going for the rest of my life. I'm quite happy to feed that back into charitable projects that they believe in. Again, I've made this sort of slagging remark about Bill Gates, but he's not the only one. There are many like them, and I've mentioned before, Anne Glogue with her thing with her eye charity and things like that. That's how people do it, because some of them, as you said, they think to themselves, hang on a minute, what am I doing with all this money? Because it is, in a lot of cases, a guilt thing. So they say, let me put it back into causes that I believe in and I can help people with, and help people to pull themselves up to improve their health.
Bill Gates is a bit of a weird character because he supports higher taxes for the rich, and he wants to pay more taxes. He wants to carry on giving charitable donations, and then Microsoft avoid tax and pretty much everywhere they go. So he's a bit of a weird character, but I doubt he...
Yeah, but you don't want to look into his medical charities and his vaccines seriously. No. That's a whole different...
Okay, so
Like-
where are we? You want to?
I think we're pretty much done.
That's cool. So, right, that's
Well,
good.
thanks
You're
for-
gonna ask for a closing statement or something like that, just to finish.
I think we've finished.
You cool?
I think we've got
Think we've
as
covered
much.
everything?
We're done here.
As
Yes,
as we
I-
can
Guys,
possibly
thanks very much.
Yeah,
No problem at all. That was
yeah,
cool.
great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent.